So, because we've had kind of a shift in the schedule, because of early release days, so we've got lots of things happening, and I need to get everybody on the same page, which is basically caught up to imperialism to the end of the 1800s by the end of next week, February 5th. So, to that end, I'm recording these lectures, and some classes may have a couple to listen to, some may not. And I'm going to try to keep these short and sweet. Obviously, this is really based on your desire to uh, know the information, to do a good job, to be prepared for an essay that you will have coming up in a couple of weeks. And that essay will include concepts from these particular chapters. And so if you are not familiar with them and don't understand them, particularly understand what I'm going to be looking for, then that's going to make it a little bit more challenging for you. So this particular section is on politics in the Gilded Age. And I've kind of circled around on some of this, so it's not totally unfamiliar to you. The big thing that I want to point out, and this particular slide shows you right there, you have a lot of Republican presidents. The Republicans are kind of a dominant party, at least with the executive branch. Now, if you're talking about the legislative branch, you have kind of an even split of power. So one of the comparisons that we see a lot is that, you kind of can see where you have a legislative branch that is dysfunctional, where there's, it's hard to tell the difference between the parties, where they don't seem to be very effective, and you have a very weak executive branch. Now, we can argue that perhaps the last 20 years, our executive branch has not been weak. It's relied heavily on executive orders. But we can certainly see some comparisons between the Gilded Age and between politics today. So just kind of look through this list. I don't need to read it off to you. But I would encourage you to hit pause and kind of read through and see kind of what it's talking about. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail on presidents, Grant. Well, we've already touched a little bit on Grant, but particularly on Hayes, going all the way up to McKinley, right? Those are kind of, I like to call them like no-name presidents. Like they get kind of in a smush bubble and it's hard to kind of keep them apart, right? But I did kind of put a list of kind of what the key issues are with those particular presidents. And so if you're trying to kind of get a sense of kind of chronology, that should help you. Pay particular attention. Grover Cleveland is the only Democrat until Woodrow Wilson, and he is elected twice, but not consecutively. Kind of an interesting little thing. So we'll be talking about all of these different issues. You can see issues about labor violence with the Haymarket riot, and you can see issues like Tammany Hall and civil service reform, Native American issues, the Dawes Allotment Act, antitrust issues with Sherman Antitrust Act, gold and silver issues, which we'll understand better by the time we get to the end of this week. And then we start to talk a lot about progressive reforms. We start to talk a lot about imperialism. So just kind of look through this list. Like I said, I encourage you to kind of hit pause. Just know that one of the dominant concerns of this period is this idea of corruption, right? So the reform movement that is coming out of the middle class is very much focused on this corruption issue. And a lot of it is because they are very concerned about the issue of patronage, which is really kind of, that we talked about this with Andrew Jackson, to the victor go the spoils, the idea that whoever wins the election gets to pass out the political jobs. And people are basically blaming that and saying that this patronage is putting bad people in charge, and this causes the government not to function very well. And so what's going to start to happen due to this patronage and these criticisms because of the economic concerns, the railroad bubble from 1877, is that you're going to have the Republican Party split between a radical kind of that Civil War era Republican that's much more committed to Reconstruction, that's much more committed to pro-business government policies, committed to the political machine, versus, say, reformers who are the ones that want to clean up politics, want to get rid of corruption. They're less concerned with continuing Reconstruction. Um, and, so you kind of get a sense, you have this division within the party. So the election of 1876, of course, is a big part of this. This is what brings Rutherford B. Hayes in. This is what ends Reconstruction. So when you're layering kind of the understanding of the social changes with kind of the emergence of segregation and Plessy v. Ferguson and that kind of thing, this is the context for how this is beginning to happen, right? And so you start to have these former Republicans coming in, trying to address some of the political corruption, but still not being very concerned about social issues. And so it's all kind of a hot mess, right? You have the Republicans that are typically, temperance people, but not always. They're pretty much always big business. Democrats tend to be all about, the government's too much in our business. They shouldn't be telling us how to run things. And in both parties, you have this push and pull over those party bosses, right? That control the selection of candidates. At the state level, they control the senators that get sent, because at this point, senators are not elected by popular vote. Senators are chosen by state legislators. And so it's the party boss that's picking that. And most of these politicians recognize that, that the party bosses are often gaining funds from big business. So in some ways, it's very similar to not similar, it's reminiscent of what we have today, where politicians have these relationships with business and special interest groups. The difference is now, like, it's all in the name of campaigning, whereas back then it was more kind of backroom deals that are being made. But you still have that one similarity, right? So we've talked about party bosses and talking about urban politics, but just know that the party boss system is affecting national politics, is affecting the federal government, is affecting state governments. And even though you have reformers, you have middle-class reformers, you have reformer wings of both political parties, they're pushing, it's this change is not happening overnight, right? So you're still having this pushback with party bosses. It won't really be until the 20th century that you start to see that significant change. And this political cartoon pretty much says it all. You can't really see it, but this one says Democrat, this one says Republican. So this is a political cartoon from, I believe, after Grover Cleveland, who I think is up here maybe. After he wins the election. So you have the Democrats kind of looking a little bit better after that particular election. But as you can see here, both of them are basically equal. So you have kind of this notion that the parties, even though you've got the executive branch dominated by the Republicans, legislatively, the parties are pretty well split. And so I think that's kind of an interesting development. So you do start to have this pressure for reform. It happens gradually and slowly. The first piece of it is going to be civil service reform, which happens, it's called the Pendleton Act of 1883. James Garfield is elected in 1882, and he is assassinated by somebody who's mentally unstable. And because the big campaign issue for him was cleaning up patronage and having civil service reform, which the idea of civil service reform is if you get a job in the government, you can't be fired based on your political party. Right, that political parties cannot like the measurement of how well you do your job is how well you do your job, not what political party you belong to. And so civil service reform gets passed. Chester Arthur has become the president. So it's kind of a head nod to Garfield and one of his big issues. Then you're going to start to see also about the same time a push for railroad regulation. Remember from our farming simulation, I mentioned that, in reality, farm transportation prices could be, larger farms, larger businesses could negotiate special rates. And so your smaller homesteads couldn't always count on the same rates for shipping. And so this is kind of meant to address this. So part of it's because of the railroad stock bubble. that triggered an economic crisis. Part of it's the frustration of farmers and the frustration of small businesses. And so you start to have some attempts to kind of adjust rates, to say everybody needs the railroad. We need to have fair rates. We need to not have special rebate deals that big companies can get where they can save money. And you have the Supreme Court supporting the fact that this is interstate commerce and that therefore the federal government can help set these rates, that you can't just do this within a state. So the Interstate Commerce Commission is a big step towards regulation. Now, it doesn't have a lot of teeth when it's first created, so it's going to take a few decades before the ICC really becomes a force, but it is created during this period. You start to have questions about tariffs, right? Where, farmers don't like tariffs, just like we've talked about before. Businesses want tariffs. We have this industrialization, so there's a lot of concern about that. And so tariffs are a hot button issue, and this question of how do we reform tariffs? Remember, at this point, we don't have an income tax. And so the government is making its money from tariffs. And so this is, in addition to the fact that the country is becoming more industrialized. So tariffs will be a hot button issue. They'll be going back and forth. It's not really going to be until you get to Woodrow Wilson and the election of 1912 that you really the development of the income tax system that we resolve the tariff issue. So like now we argue about taxes. Back then we argued about tariffs. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of a similar argument. Like who is the system working for, right? In the case of tariffs, that system was working for big business. And probably one of the most significant reforms is going to be the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It comes out of the muckraking, the journalists that are talking about monopolies and trusts. It comes out of the concern about worker violence who are frustrated because they can't go find a better job. It's consumers who are frustrated because they don't have a choice. They're kind of stuck paying whatever rate John Rockefeller or whatever industry giant has decided they're going to pay, right? And so people are getting pretty frustrated, and they look at horizontal integration and they say, that's not really fair. That's destroying competition, and we don't like that. And so they start making these demands for Congress to take action. So, and keep in mind, we've had some economic contractions and all that kind of stuff, and people are blaming it on the fact that these monopolies, these corporations have gotten too big. So that should sound a little bit familiar to today. And so they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which is intended to go after companies that restrict opportunity, restrict individualism, anything that restricts trade. Now, the problem is the Sherman Antitrust Act is not, it doesn't have a lot of teeth at this point. It's not going to be until Teddy Roosevelt that you really see him using this law. But it is put on the books at this point. So it's important to know that. Keep in mind that even though you have these baby steps towards reform, a lot of Americans are frustrated. We've talked about the middle class, that they are frustrated with the poverty that they see. They're frustrated by the corruption that they see. And they are living in a world where hard work and education has benefited them. And they want government to be able to enable the working classes and the poor to be able to have that opportunity. And so they're wanting that. So they're part of these, especially kind of political and city reform. You have a lot of people asking questions, why is John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie so wealthy, but why are our farmers struggling? Why are our factory workers struggling, right? And farmers in particular are feeling very frustrated, right? Because the small homesteads, you remember all those people had moved out west, and here they are trying to deal with large railroad companies, with large corporate farms. And what they see is that the government doesn't really care, that they are stuck in this cycle of poverty, that they're keeping tariffs high, that are driving down agricultural prices. And they really feel, because of this kind of constant dependency on banking, they blame kind of the gold standard. They blame the money supply. They want loose money, right? So they want more money being pumped into the economy, whether that's paper money, whether that's silver money, whether that's gold, whatever it is, they want to get more money into the economy. So it's easier to borrow money It's kind of money has this kind of supply and demand issue with it. And so they're demanding some changes, right? And of course, the real issue that we see happening here for both workers and for farmers is that there's lots of production, right? Factories are getting more efficient. Farming is getting more efficient. So we're producing more stuff, and that having produced more stuff means that farm prices are low. Means that they're keeping tariffs high because companies are making so much stuff they have to protect their markets. And one thing to stick in the back of your head too is this is going to be an impetus for why there's imperialism, right? Because we are making so much stuff, we've got to have markets to sell all of the stuff that we're making. So this gets us into the silver issue and money supply. And I've got some videos that you'll watch later this week that will kind of tell you about the silver issue a little bit more. But just understand that money supply is about how much spendable money is in the economy. If you don't have enough, interest rates are high and it's expensive to borrow, which you can see why that would hurt farmers. If there's too much, money is not as valuable. It makes interest rates lower. Great for farmers, but not so great for banks and not so great for stock markets, right? And so banks don't really like inflated money. They don't like loose money supply. So they want to stay as close to the gold standard. They want to keep the money supply restricted. But understand that there has been a history. Go back to the Continentals, go back to the greenbacks of the Civil War. Whenever there was a mining find, if you discover gold, it increases the money supply, and so then that can loosen things, whether it's gold or silver. And so there is kind of this attempt at times to introduce silver into the money supply. It just kind of depends, right, on what period you're talking about. But this is about currency that's backed by some kind of precious metal, is really what it is. And so the prevailing question is how much is in the economy? And farmers and businesses who both borrow money, businesses to borrow to expand, to do research and development, or farmers who are constantly in that cycle of debt, like we saw with the simulation, they are getting pretty frustrated. And small businesses in particular feel very, very vulnerable in this cycle. And so what you're going to see is that these farms begin to start forming into their own kind of unionization in order to try to exert some power. So just kind of like we saw with the workers who are frustrated by all this consolidation, feel very powerless in this process, what you're going to see is that farmers will kind of begin to create their own organizations as well in order to kind of push back against the system. And so that's where we kind of get to one of the major kind of third-party movements that happen. So you have several farming organizations, you have, and it kind of increases, kind of like we saw with unions, which start with these large labor unions, these national movements, and then it moves into more kind of, the Knights of Labor has all these different chapters. And then ultimately you ended up with the American Federation of Labor that was less radical, right? You actually have the opposite effect taking place with farmers, where they start very small, very local, right? Called the Grange. And this is about local efforts, local, information, kind of local cooperation, and trying to make an impact just within their little tiny county or whatever, right? But what begins to happen is they realize that that's not enough influence, right? So they start to embrace a group called the Farmers Alliance that actually starts in Texas, and they begin to advocate for what are called state exchanges, and these state exchanges are meant to control supply. So as the Farmers Alliance begins to kind of coalesce around kind of creating more of a statewide kind of organization. So this idea is that there would be these state exchanges that would buy up surplus crops and be able to hold on to them in order to control supply, and that the controlling supply would then raise prices, right? So it's kind of an attempt to influence the market, if you will. In addition, the Farmers Alliance suggests that it would provide low interest loans. Now, part of what happens with these farmers alliances is that, and again, they're based on states, right? Some states are a little more successful than others, but generally speaking, they end up facing pushback from the railroad companies. The railroad companies don't want to have to negotiate with the alliances. And banks don't like the competition for the loans. So the alliances are facing a real uphill battle. And they certainly don't have the political power. So I really would compare that to kind of the reaction to the union. So this idea that workers would collectively get together and try to influence wages and prices is kind of the same. They have the same attitude towards farmers that would try to get together and influence wages or prices and kind of supply. And so all of this frustration, this sense of not having political power, is going to result in the creation of the People's Party, which is also known as the Populist Party. Now, this is capital P populist. There are still populists today that talk about that, people should, that whenever groups of people get together to vote, that kind of thing, that's little p populism. But this is the big P populist party. And it becomes an actual political party that has some success in the early 1890s, rather. Pushing state level candidates, right? And their big plan, and what's interesting about the populist platform is that, and I encourage you to review, I think it's in your primary documents for, I don't know if it's module 17 or module 18. I know it's in the American YOP Reader. They actually have excerpts from the Populist Party platform. And what's fascinating about it is they really address a lot of the common problems. And the other interesting thing is a lot of these reforms will then become permanent with the progressive movement, right? So they have things like a sub-treasury plan where the federal government buys surplus crops, stores them, manages the supply, makes sure that farmers are able to sell their crops for a decent price. The modern equivalent to that is farming subsidies, right? Is basically what that is. But that was a new concept. And so they're proposing this. They talk about loosening up the money supply, for particularly with the idea of the coinage of silver. Part of that is going to be because there's several silver strikes in the West, and so they feel like silver is plentiful. They propose railroad regulation, much more regulation than what the Interstate Commerce Commission had suggested. So they're trying to strengthen that. They want direct election of senators. They want to eliminate the party machine by having senators accountable to the people. They want an income tax, right? Let's get rid of the tariff. Let's just charge people based on how much income they make, rather than tilting the government, the way the government makes money, so that they penalize farmers at and help industry. They talk about an 8-hour workday, so they're responding to unionization, trying to broaden their appeal beyond just farmers. And then they just basically have general government regulation, schooling regulation, issues about democratic reforms. And so they become really a true third party. They are somewhat competitive, at least at the state level. And they are enough of a threat at the state level that they force the two major parties to begin to change, right? And because they force the two major parties to begin to change, it then has a larger effect at the national level. And so farmers and the populist movement is a very significant change that takes place that you want to be sure that you understand. So if you have any questions about what the Populist Party is doing, be sure you let me know. Go back to the textbook, reread it, come ask me, something like that, because they're certainly very important, right? Now, part of the issue, and this kind of dovetails with what we were talking about as far as kind of segregation and discrimination and Jim Crow and kind of the restrictions on voting, is that there's a real concern that the Populist Party is appealing to blacks and whites, right? That because it's populist, little p populist, that it doesn't matter what race you are, that it's more based on economic status. And remember, you still be thinking, thanks to the thanks to Andrew Johnson, you still have that small group of wealthy landowners in the South, right, that control all the land. And in the West, you've had this accumulation by these large mining companies or these large farms. And so these large landowners they don't like the threat to their power. Large corporations don't like the threat to their power. And so you start to have this disfranchisement, right? You start to have violence, and some of that kind of segregation, some of the voting restrictions come into place in order to control access to the ballot box and encourage division between blacks and whites. Now, what will happen is that workers in the North don't really identify with the Populist Party, even though they have the 8-hour workday. And part of it, too, is that they have William Jennings Bryan running for them, and he doesn't resonate with immigrant workers, right? He comes off, he's very kind of nativist, that kind of thing. And McKinley will sell himself as kind of this moderate, I don't have to be as far as a populist, but but I can talk about some changes. We can modify things. So think very much kind of your Joe Biden sort of character, right? Is who McKinley kind of sells himself as. And so you do start to have the parties moving more towards reform, especially with the election of McKinley in 1896. And so you start to see that there are some changes that take place. And of course, the economy is helped a great deal by the Klondike Gold Rush. The discovery of gold in Alaska that kind of loosens up the money supply. So part of the big kind of impact is that the economy improves and you have some moderate reforms. And so it kind of eases off some of the stress that we saw. But you want to keep in mind that you have some major reforms that maybe aren't being used to their fullest extent prior to 1900, but will become very important farther on down the line. Things like the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, tariffs, Interstate Commerce Commission, the Sherman Antitrust Act. You'll have, kind of William Jennings Bryan and kind of the gold and silver issue that will be around. We'll see that begin to be resolved as we move into the progressive era. And the reforms that the Populist Party was talking about will eventually become the standard for the progressive movement, right? Income tax, direct election of senators, secret ballot, primary elections, those will be pretty permanent things. William Jennings Bryan, he's famous for giving his Cross of Gold speech, where he basically criticizes devotion to the gold standard, loosening up the money supply. And he technically runs for the Democratic Party, but he's not as, like I said, he's just not as palatable to workers and that sort of thing. And so that's how McKinley's able to kind of hold on to power. So William Jennings Bryan is kind of an interesting character in this. He is, how would I compare him? Maybe the Bernie Sanders of his day, something along those lines. Probably not quite as radical as Bernie Sanders, but you get the idea. Somebody who runs for president several times, certainly is kind of a hot button issue. Kind of people have strong feelings about him. So it's kind of interesting in the political realm as far as that's concerned. And I wanted to show you a few political cartoons just to kind of touch on some of these themes. This is James Garfield. I don't know. Let me kind of expand this a little bit so you can see it better. James Garfield, honesty, ability, patriotism. He's going after corruption, kind of cleaning out the snakes, right? Drain the swamp kind of stuff is what you see with James Garfield. But of course, he gets assassinated, and that's part of why you have this push towards civil service reform. This is another political cartoon, basically kind of criticizing the Senate for trying to destroy civil service reform. Basically, they're criticizing what they see as kind of watering down Garfield's reforms. So you see kind of the god of patronage right here, the spoils. You have these represent a variety of different, politicians. And then you have civil service reform being basically slaughtered at the feet of patronage. And so kind of depicts how that is such kind of a hot button issue and why you have this push for reform. This kind of shows you the party boss system, kind of describes that in a pretty clear detail. You've got immunity, you've got special privileges, you've got franchises, you've got all these people kind of rushing and grabbing from the party boss these favors. And of course, this cartoon is about Tammany Hall, pointing, that it's really this guy who's in charge. I'm not the boss. This guy's the boss. And how everyone just kind of, points to somebody else. Of course, this guy right here is Boss Tweed, and he's the one that will ultimately be found guilty of running that. This is going to be kind of the saloons. This is an anti-saloon, so the temperance movement, kind of the idea that the saloons give birth to murder, poverty, suicide, and that the government is in favor of the saloons and that people need to rise up against it. This one has to do with trusts and monopolies, that they are too powerful in the government. And so actually these different guys represent different trusts. There's one guy that represents like the meat industry, another one that represents Rockefeller, and basically that they are controlling the government and they are going to destroy the government, that they're going to turn us not into a democracy anymore, and that good government needs to come back into play. This one says, kind of depicts kind of the impact of economic trusts, that if we don't break the power of these large corporations, that they're the ones who are working with the party machines and kind of corrupting government and that kind of thing. And that only democracy can save it, that we have to promote these kind of political reforms. And this one kind of talks about the money issue, right? That has to do with, you have the silver issue, that the path to prosperity is a loose money supply, that the idea of being stuck in just the gold standard is not going to let us grow and develop the way we should. And then this last one has to do with William Jennings Bryan, him as kind of a pseudo-populist taking over the Democratic Party. So this, you remember I said he kind of is reminiscent of Bernie Sanders as a socialist taking over the Democratic Party. You absolutely have William Jennings Bryan kind of being, depicted this way, is that he's swallowing up the Democratic Party. Now, what we'll see is that's really not true. But he does, you do absolutely have this concern about the influence of this third party and what it's going to do to government. So that's it for the national political stage. So hopefully this helped clarify some things. If you have any questions, please let me know. And so anyways,